Buckingham Palace has 775 rooms, 800 staff, and 39 acres of private garden in the center of London. It is the most famous royal residence on earth, and no monarch who has ever lived there has wanted to stay. William IV tried to give it to Parliament. Victoria abandoned it for 40 years. George VI called it the icebox. Elizabeth II begged Churchill to let her remain somewhere else. And Charles III, who became king in 2022, has simply refused to move in at all. This is the story of a building that was never meant to be a palace, and the 260-year trap it became. Chapter 1: A swamp, a duke, and a terrible idea. Before there was a palace, there was a marsh, fed by a buried river that still flows beneath the courtyard today. The River Tyburn once ran openly through this part of London. It wound south from the hills of Hampstead, cut through what is now Regent's Park, passed beneath the line of Oxford Street, and emptied into the Thames near the grounds of Westminster Abbey. By the late 17th century, London had begun to swallow it. Streets were laid over its banks, drains were dug to redirect its flow. But the water did not vanish. It sank. It became a subterranean presence, seeping upward through the soil, softening the clay, feeding the boggy ground that stretched west of St. James's Park. The land was low, it was wet, and it was cheap. This was the ground on which John Sheffield, the first Duke of Buckingham and Normanby, chose to build his London residence in 1703. Sheffield was a man of considerable self-regard and moderate talent. A courtier, a poet of minor reputation, and a political survivor who had served under 4 monarchs, he wanted a house that would announce his position to anyone approaching from the east. The site he selected offered something no other plot in Westminster could match. It sat at the western end of a long, straight avenue that ran directly toward St. James's Palace. Anyone walking down that avenue, which would later become the Mall, would see Sheffield's new house framed at its end like the focal point of a painting. The house he built was handsome. It was brick. It had a wide central block with 2 flanking wings, a forecourt, and a view across gardens to the park beyond. The interiors were comfortable, but not lavish. There were enough rooms for a gentleman and his household, and no more. It cost approximately £7,000. For context, a skilled London tradesman at the time might earn £50 a year. The house was substantial, but it was a private dwelling. It had no throne room, no ballroom, no audience chamber. It was not designed to hold ceremonies, host foreign ambassadors, or project the authority of a nation. It was designed to hold one ambitious duke and his collection of paintings. Sheffield died in 1721. His widow and then his illegitimate son held the property for another 2 decades. The house sat quietly at the end of its avenue, accumulating the minor repairs and seasonal complaints of any London property built on damp ground. The Tyburn continued its invisible work beneath the foundations. Moisture crept through cellar walls. The garden, lush and green in summer, sat heavy and sodden through the winter months. No one standing in that forecourt in 1720 could have guessed what the building would become. It was pleasant. It was well proportioned. It was entirely unsuited to the role that history was about to force upon it. The swamp beneath it would never fully dry. The river would never stop flowing. And the modest domestic bones of Sheffield's townhouse would be buried, layer by layer, beneath the weight of something far larger than any duke had ever imagined. The building had not yet learned to be hungry, but the ground, was already unstable. Chapter 2. The King Who Bought a Cage. George III paid £21,000 for a family home, never suspecting he had purchased an obligation that would outlast his dynasty. The year was 1761. George was 22 years old, newly crowned, and recently married to Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a woman he had met for the first time on their wedding day. He needed a house. St. James's Palace, the official royal residence, was dark, cramped, and medieval in its layout. Its corridors smelled of tallow and old stone. Its rooms were cold. George wanted somewhere lighter, somewhere his growing family could live in something approaching domestic comfort. Buckingham House, as it was still known, seemed ideal. It was private, it was near the park, it had gardens, and it was available. George bought it from Sheffield's descendant for £21,000 and designated it as the Queen's House, a private retreat for Charlotte and their children. It would not replace St. James's Palace as the official seat of the court. It would simply be a home. Sir William Chambers, one of the finest architects in England, was brought in to remodel the interior. Chambers was a man of discipline and restraint. He worked within the existing structure, creating elegant rooms of moderate scale. A library was built for the king's growing collection of books, which would eventually number over 65,000 volumes. Nurseries were added. The house expanded gently, growing to accommodate what would become one of the largest royal families in British history. Charlotte bore 15 children. 14 of them were born in this house. The Queen's house became, for a brief and unrepeatable moment, exactly what George had wanted: a home. Children ran through the corridors. Music was played in the evenings. The king walked in his gardens and tended his interests in botany and agriculture. It was the closest the building would ever come to warmth. But George had done something else in those early years of his reign, something that seemed unrelated to the house, but would shape its destiny permanently. In 1760, as part of the financial settlement that accompanied his accession, George surrendered the hereditary revenues of the crown to Parliament. In exchange, he received a fixed annual payment, the civil list, to fund royal duties and household costs. It was a pragmatic arrangement. The crown's estates were mismanaged and unprofitable. The civil list offered stability. What it also created was dependency. From that moment forward, the monarch could not build, renovate, or maintain a royal residence without parliamentary approval. The house George had bought with his own money was now functionally tied to the state. Its future would be determined not by the wishes of whoever lived inside it, but by the willingness of politicians to fund it. And politicians, as every subsequent monarch would discover, are generous with ceremony and miserly with plumbing. George himself would not suffer the consequences. His mind deteriorated in his later years, and he spent his final decade confined at Windsor Castle, blind and largely unaware of the world around him. He died in 1820. The modest house he had bought for his wife and children passed to his eldest son, and his eldest son had very different ideas about what a building should be. The cage was built, the lock was turned, and the key had been handed to Parliament. Chapter 3. The Son Who Wanted a Masterpiece. Parliament authorized £150,000, and George IV spent nearly £700,000, creating rooms of staggering beauty that he would never sleep in. George IV was not like his father. Where George III was modest, domestic, and cautious with money, his son was extravagant, theatrical, and utterly indifferent to cost. He had already transformed Carlton House into one of the most opulent residences in Europe, then declared it insufficient and had it demolished. He had built the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, a fantasia of Indian domes and Chinese interiors that astonished and scandalized in equal measure. Now, as king, he turned his attention to Buckingham House. His ambition was simple and ruinous. He wanted a palace. He found his architect in John Nash, a man of 68 with a gift for grand urban scenery and a flexible relationship with budgets. Nash had already redesigned Regent Street and laid out Regent's Park. He understood scale, he understood drama, and he understood, perhaps too well, that his royal patron would approve almost anything. Parliament authorized £150,000 for the transformation. Nash began work in 1825. Within 2 years, the cost had doubled. Within 4, it had tripled. The final expenditure would approach £700,000, a sum so vast that it triggered a parliamentary investigation and ended Nash's career. But what Nash created was extraordinary. He kept the shell of the old house and wrapped it in grandeur. The state rooms along the west side of the building were designed as a sequence of increasingly magnificent spaces. The green drawing room led to the throne room, which opened onto the picture gallery, a vast corridor of top-lit splendor 155 feet long. The ceilings were coffered and gilded. The walls were hung with crimson silk. The floors were laid with parquet in geometric patterns. The grand staircase rose through the center of the building beneath a dome of stained glass. Its balustrade was cast in bronze and gilded, each panel worked with scrolling acanthus and classical figures. The blue drawing room was fitted with 30 columns of imitation onyx. The white drawing room received a ceiling so densely ornamented with gilded plasterwork that it seemed to press downward with the weight of its own beauty. Nash also designed the Marble Arch, a monumental gateway of white Carrara marble intended to stand at the entrance to the forecourt. It was modeled on the Arch of Constantine in Rome. It cost approximately £34,000. It was too narrow for the state coach to pass through. By 1829, Parliament had lost patience. A select committee was convened. Nash was questioned, humiliated, and dismissed. Edward Blore, a competent but uninspired architect, was brought in to finish the work. The accounts were never fully reconciled. Overruns of this magnitude do not lend themselves to clean bookkeeping. George IV followed his architect into disgrace. His health had been failing for years. He had grown enormously fat, reclusive, and dependent on laudanum. He died on the 26th of June, 1830, at Windsor Castle. He had never spent a single night in the palace he had created, not one. His brother, William IV, inherited both the throne and the building. William was blunt, practical, and horrified by the expense. When the old Palace of Westminster burned down in 1834, he saw his chance. He offered Buckingham Palace to Parliament as its new home. "Take it," he said. "Use it for the Commons and the Lords. The nation needs a legislature more than I need gilded drawing rooms." Parliament declined. The building was judged unsuitable for political purposes. Its rooms were too ornate, its corridors too narrow, its layout too domestic despite all of Nash's ambitions. And so the palace remained royal property. The crown could not use it comfortably. The state would not take it. And the cycle that would define the building's next 2 centuries had begun. £700,000 spent. 0 nights occupied by the king who commissioned it, 1 architect destroyed, 1 offer of surrender rejected. The palace had consumed its first fortune, claimed its first reputation, and refused its first attempt at escape. It was just getting started. Chapter 4. The Palace That Made a Queen Miserable. When 18-year-old Victoria moved in, the chimneys smoked so badly that fires had to die, and the smell never left the corridors. Victoria arrived at Buckingham Palace in July of 1837, 3 weeks after becoming queen. She was young, she was determined, and she was appalled. The building she entered bore little resemblance to the gleaming vision Nash had designed on paper. The state rooms were largely complete, but the rest of the palace was a shambles. Chimneys drew poorly, or not at all. Smoke backed into rooms and stained the walls. Windows could not be opened because the mechanisms had never been properly installed. Doors were missing from some rooms entirely. Carpets had not been laid. Servants' quarters were damp and cramped. The kitchen was so far from the dining rooms that food arrived cold, carried through labyrinthine corridors by footmen who sometimes lost their way. The ventilation system, such as it was, circulated stale air through passages that smelled of coal dust, mildew, and drains. The household itself was a study in dysfunction. Responsibility was split between 3 separate departments: the Lord Chamberlain, the Lord Steward, and the Master of the Horse. Their jurisdictions overlapped and contradicted. The Lord Chamberlain's office was responsible for the inside of the windows. The Master of the Horse was responsible for the outside. If a pane of glass cracked, both offices had to agree on its repair before anyone lifted a finger. This was not a joke. This was the actual administrative structure of the royal household. Victoria endured it for the first years of her reign. She was occupied with the novelty of power, the drama of the bedchamber crisis, her infatuation with Lord Melbourne, and then, overwhelmingly, her courtship and marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840. Albert changed everything. He was systematic where Victoria was emotional. He was practical where the household was theatrical. He audited the accounts and discovered waste on a staggering scale. He reformed the staff structure, consolidated the overlapping departments, and imposed a regime of efficiency that was received by the existing servants with something between resentment and terror. He also addressed the building. Edward Blore was brought back to design a new east wing that would close the courtyard and provide additional rooms for the growing family. Victoria and Albert would have 9 children. They needed nurseries, school rooms, and staff accommodation that the original building had never been designed to provide. Blore's East Wing was completed in 1850. It was plain, it was functional, it was everything Nash's work was not. The Portland stone facade that faces the mall today is not Blore's. That came later. Blore built in cane stone, a softer material that would weather badly in London's acidic air. But the wing served its purpose. It enclosed the forecourt. It added 104 rooms, and it created the central balcony. The balcony was Albert's idea, a simple architectural addition, a projecting platform with stone balustrades set above the central entrance of the new East Wing. It was designed so that the royal family could appear before crowds gathered in the forecourt below. No one could have predicted what it would become. Over the next century and a half, that balcony would be the stage for coronation appearances, victory celebrations, royal weddings, and jubilee gatherings. It would become the single most photographed architectural detail in Britain, It would be the image people conjure when they think of the monarchy itself. It emerged from a period of domestic misery. That is the palace's deepest contradiction. Its most beloved feature was born not from joy or celebration, but from the practical need to manage a building that resisted management. Albert fought the palace every day. He battled the smoke, the cold, the bureaucracy, and the creeping damp that rose from the Tyburn below. He installed modern heating. He rewired the bells. He reorganized the service corridors so that the 760 windows could be cleaned on a rational schedule, and the 1,514 doors could be maintained without jurisdictional warfare. The army of staff required to run the building was itself a small institution. Housemaids rose before dawn under the supervision of senior staff. Coal was carried to dozens of fireplaces each morning. Silver was polished weekly. Linen was laundered in vast basement rooms where steam condensed on stone ceilings and dripped back onto the ironing boards. The palace consumed labor the way it consumed money, endlessly, invisibly, without gratitude. Albert gave the building 15 years of his attention. It was not enough, but it was more than anyone else would give until the 21st century. Chapter 5. 40 Years of Silence. After Albert died, Victoria locked the doors, and for 4 decades the most powerful woman on earth let her palace rot. Albert died on the 14th of December, 1861, at Windsor Castle. He was 42. The cause was typhoid fever, though modern historians have suggested stomach cancer or Crohn's disease as possible contributing factors. The precise diagnosis matters less than the effect. Victoria was destroyed. She withdrew from public life almost entirely. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She refused to appear at ceremonies. She declined to open Parliament in person for years at a stretch, and she abandoned Buckingham Palace. The building sat. Season after season, year after year, the palace stood largely empty at the center of London. The staterooms were closed. The private apartments were shuttered. Dust gathered on Nash's gilded ceilings. Moisture crept upward from the old Tyburn riverbed, softening plaster, blooming across walls in patches of mold that the skeleton staff could not keep pace with. Paint flaked. Upholstery faded. The heating systems Albert had installed fell into disrepair because there was no one to repair them for. Victoria preferred Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, a villa she and Albert had designed together. She preferred Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands, where the air was clean and the gillies did not bow. She returned to London only when political necessity absolutely demanded it, and even then she stayed as briefly as possible. The public noticed. In 1864, someone pinned a handwritten note to the railings of Buckingham Palace. It read, in the style of a property advertisement, that these commanding premises were to be let or sold in consequence of the late occupants' declining business. It was a small act of satire. It was also a genuine expression of public frustration. The Queen was invisible. Her palace was a monument to absence. Behind the ceremonial facades, the building contained another world entirely. The palace was threaded with hidden corridors, narrow staircases, and concealed doors designed so that servants could move through the building without ever being seen by the family or their guests. These passages ran behind the state rooms, beneath the principal floors, and through the attic stories. They were lit by gas, then later by electricity, but always dimly. They were functional, cramped, and cold. The most famous of these hidden features was the secret door in the white drawing room. Concealed within a mirrored cabinet beside the fireplace, it opened onto a private corridor that allowed the monarch to enter the room without passing through any public space. It was, and remains, the sovereign's personal escape route. A door disguised as furniture, hidden in a room of gold and glass, leading to a dim passage that runs to the private apartments. It is a perfect metaphor. The palace offers no honest exit. Even its escapes are secret. During Victoria's long absence, the infrastructure aged without intervention. Pipes corroded. Wiring, where it existed, became brittle. The lead drainage system, original to Nash's construction, began to sag under its own weight. The Tyburn's underground moisture continued its patient work on the foundations. No major renovation was undertaken. No structural survey was commissioned. The building was not maintained. It was merely preserved in a state of slow decline, like a body kept alive but unattended. Victoria returned to public view in gradual increments during the 1880s and 90s, pressured by prime ministers and the growing Republican sentiment that her absence had fed. She celebrated her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and her Diamond Jubilee in 1897. The palace was opened and cleaned and lit for these occasions, but it was a performance. The building was dressed for the audience and then closed again. Victoria died on the 22nd of January, 1901 at Osborne House. She was 81. She had reigned for 63 years. She had spent fewer than a quarter of them in her London palace. The building she left behind was intact but neglected. Its grandeur was undimmed on the surface. Its bones were rotting underneath. The new king would fill its rooms with light and laughter and champagne, but even he could not make it warm. Chapter 6. Glittering rooms. Freezing halls. Edward VII filled every state room with crystal, champagne, and the most glamorous people in Europe, and still could not make the building feel like home. Edward had waited nearly 60 years to be king. He was 59 when his mother finally died. He had spent those decades cultivating a reputation for pleasure, sophistication, and scandal that made him both the most popular and the most distrusted member of the royal family. He loved food, horse racing, beautiful women, and the company of people who knew how to enjoy themselves. He had no use for mourning, and he had very definite ideas about what a palace should feel like. Within months of his accession, Edward ordered the redecorating of the principal rooms. Victoria's heavy dark furnishings were removed. The palette shifted to cream, gold, and white. Electric light was installed throughout the state rooms, replacing the gas that had given the interiors a yellowish, flickering cast. New chandeliers were hung. The picture gallery was rehung. The throne room was refreshed. The blue drawing room recovered its intended brilliance. The palace became, for the first time, a genuine center of social power. Edward hosted state banquets for 170 guests at a single sitting. The table stretched the length of the ballroom, laid with silver gilt plate from the royal collection, each setting comprising a precise arrangement of glasses, cutlery, and porcelain that took the household staff an entire day to prepare. Footmen stood at intervals of 6 feet. Courses arrived in strict sequence. Conversation was conducted at a volume that allowed one's neighbors to hear, but no one else. The debutante presentations became the most anticipated events of the London season. Young women from aristocratic and wealthy families were presented to the king and queen in the throne room. They wore white gowns, long trains, and ostrich feather headdresses. They approached the throne, curtsied to a prescribed depth, and withdrew without turning their backs. The ritual was ancient, absurd, and utterly compelling. It continued until 1958. Edward's court attracted the leading figures of European aristocracy, diplomacy, and finance. The palace's guest lists read like a catalog of Edwardian power. Weekends at Sandringham were for intimates. The palace was for display. And Edward displayed with a confidence and a scale that no previous monarch had attempted within its walls. But Edward did not live there, not really. His heart remained at Marlborough House, the residence he had occupied as Prince of Wales, just a few hundred yards down the Mall. Marlborough House was smaller, warmer, more intimate. It had rooms that felt like rooms, not like galleries. Edward used the palace as his office and his stage. He performed kingship there. He did not inhabit it. In 1913, 2 years after Edward's death, his successor, George V, commissioned the architect Aston Webb to redesign the east facade. Bloor's Caen stone front had deteriorated badly in London's polluted air. Webb replaced it in Portland stone, a harder, paler material that would resist the soot and acid of the city. The new facade was classical, symmetrical, and imposing. It was completed in just 13 weeks. An astonishing feat of construction that required the old front to be stripped and the new one erected while the household continued to function inside. Webb's facade is the one the world knows. It is the backdrop to every coronation photograph, every royal wedding wave, every VE Day celebration. Its flat, pale front, with its central balcony and flanking rows of windows, has become so synonymous with the British monarchy that most people assume it has always looked this way. It has not. It is barely a century old. The building behind it is older. The ground beneath it is older still. The palace reached its architectural and ceremonial peak in these Edwardian years. The rooms were beautiful. The facade was new. The social calendar was full. 374 clocks ticked in unison, wound by a team of horologists who spent 2 days each week moving from room to room. 1,900 light bulbs illuminated the state rooms. 40,000 pieces of silver gilt and porcelain were catalogued and maintained. The building had never looked better. It had never worked harder, and it had never been less of a home. The First World War would destroy the social world that these rooms were built to serve. The aristocratic networks that filled the guest lists, the debutante rituals, the elaborate court protocols, the assumption that a palace existed primarily to project the splendor of a ruling class. All of it would be swept away by 4 years of mechanized slaughter on the Western Front. The palace would survive. The world it was designed for would not. The building did not know this yet. It gleamed. It waited. And it consumed. Chapter 7. 9 Bombs and a Declaration. On the 13th of September, 1940, 5 high explosive bombs struck the palace while the king and queen stood inside. The Second World War reached Buckingham Palace early and often. The first bomb fell on the grounds in September 1940 during the sustained German air campaign known as the Blitz. Over the course of the war, the palace would be struck 16 times. 9 bombs caused significant damage. The Royal Chapel, a richly decorated space on the south side of the building, was destroyed entirely by a direct hit. It was never rebuilt in its original form. Its ruins were eventually converted into the Queen's Gallery, an exhibition space open to the public. A policeman was killed at the Northern Lodge during one of the raids. staff sheltered in basement corridors originally designed for wine storage. Windows throughout the building were blown out repeatedly and replaced with boards. The swimming pool, installed in the 1930s, was drained and used as storage. The bombing of the 13th of September was the most dramatic. The king and queen were in residence. A German aircraft flew directly up the mall in daylight and released its payload. 5 high explosive bombs struck the palace. One destroyed the chapel. Others damaged the inner quadrangle and the north side of the building. George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, felt the blasts from the rooms where they were working. They refused to leave. This decision, maintained throughout the war, transformed the palace's meaning. George and Elizabeth stayed in London. They visited bomb sites in the East End, where entire streets had been flattened. They walked through rubble and spoke to families who had lost everything. The Queen's declaration that she could now look the East End in the face, having been bombed herself, became one of the defining statements of wartime Britain. It was not entirely fair. The royal family had access to shelters, country estates, and resources that no East End family possessed. But the symbolism mattered. The palace had been hit. The king had stayed. The building that had always symbolized privilege and separation was now, however imperfectly, a symbol of shared suffering. The war ended. The bombs stopped. But their consequences continued. The structural damage was repaired, but the repairs were hasty, undertaken in a period of national austerity when materials and skilled labor were scarce. Electrical systems were patched rather than replaced. Plumbing was rerouted around damaged sections rather than redesigned. Heating infrastructure was jury-rigged to restore function, not to ensure longevity. These wartime and post-war fixes became the building's new baseline. They were never intended to last more than a few years. They would, in many cases, remain in service for more than 7 decades. The palace had earned a new kind of legitimacy. It was no longer just the home of the sovereign. It was a survivor. It had stood while London burned. It bore scars. Those scars gave it a moral authority it had never previously possessed. But moral authority does not fix boilers. The building's physical needs had been deferred, not eliminated. And the next monarch to enter its doors would discover exactly how cold a palace can get. Chapter 8: The Icebox and the Reluctant Queen. George VI called the palace the icebox, and when his daughter inherited the throne, she begged not to move in. George had never expected to be king. His brother Edward VIII's abdication in December 1936 thrust the crown upon a man who was shy, who struggled with a stammer, and who had no desire for the public exposure that kingship demanded. The palace was one more burden. It was freezing. The heating systems, patched together before and after the war, were hopelessly inadequate for a building of this size. The corridors were cold enough in winter that staff wore overcoats indoors. The private apartments, scattered across the building's upper floors, were isolated from one another by vast stretches of unheated corridor. George and Queen Elizabeth occupied rooms on the first floor. The Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret had their quarters elsewhere. Family members communicated through equerries and private secretaries, passing messages through offices rather than speaking face to face. The palace imposed distance. Its scale, which had been designed to impress visitors, had the effect of separating the people who lived there. A father could not call to his daughter across a corridor. He sent a note through a page. Meals were formal, even in private. The architecture enforced protocol. The building would not allow intimacy. George endured it. He performed his duties with conscientious misery, opening Parliament, hosting state visits, standing on the balcony. His health deteriorated. He was a heavy smoker. Lung cancer was diagnosed. He died on the 6th of February, 1952, at Sandringham. He was 56. His elder daughter, Princess Elizabeth, was in Kenya when she received the news. She returned to England as Queen Elizabeth II at the age of 25. She and her husband, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, had been living at Clarence House, a relatively modest residence just a few hundred yards from the palace. They had renovated it. They had made it their own. It was, by all accounts, the only home Elizabeth ever truly loved. She did not want to leave it. She asked Churchill, the Prime Minister, whether it might be possible to remain at Clarence House and use the palace only for official functions. Churchill said no. The sovereign must reside at Buckingham Palace. It was tradition. It was expectation. It was, in the language of constitutional convention, necessary. Philip was reportedly furious. He had invested time and energy in Clarence House. He had no fondness for the palace's vast, cold corridors, its ancient plumbing, its culture of deference and departmental rigidity. But the decision was not theirs to make. The building's gravitational pull was stronger than personal preference. The crown moved in. Elizabeth adapted. She was disciplined, dutiful, and profoundly resilient. She made the palace function as her office and accepted that it would never function as her home. She kept her private apartments as comfortable as possible and spent every available weekend at Windsor Castle, where the rooms were smaller and the family could live something approaching a normal life. But the building continued to decay around her. The wartime repairs aged. The post-war patches failed. Over a third of the royal estate, which includes Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and other official residences, fell into disrepair by the late 20th century. Pipes leaked, wires frayed, plaster crumbled in rooms that visitors never saw. In 2009, a request was made to Parliament for £4 million in emergency repairs to the palace's most critical systems. The request was denied. Austerity was the political mood. Royal expenditure was scrutinized. The building waited. Its walls absorbed more damp. Its wires carried current through insulation that crumbled at the touch. Its boilers groaned through another winter. The palace was now a place where the sovereign served the building. She worked in it. She received ambassadors in it. She hosted state banquets in it, but she did not belong to it. She belonged, if anywhere, to the small rooms at Windsor, where her corgis slept on the furniture and the television was on in the evenings. A fire at another castle would change the equation entirely. Chapter 9. The Night Windsor Burned. On the 20th of November, 1992, fire tore through Windsor Castle, and the solution it forced would change Buckingham Palace forever. The fire started in Queen Victoria's private chapel at Windsor, when a spotlight ignited a curtain. Within minutes, flames were racing through the state apartments. 9 principal rooms were destroyed entirely. Over 100 more were damaged. The blaze burned for 15 hours. Over 200 firefighters battled it. The roof collapsed in sections. Medieval timber framing, Tudor brickwork, and Georgian plasterwork were consumed together. The restoration would cost £37 million. The question of who should pay became a national argument. Public opinion, shaped by recession and a growing skepticism toward the cost of the monarchy, was hostile. Why should taxpayers rebuild a royal castle when hospitals were underfunded and schools were crumbling? The answer, when it came, was unprecedented. The Queen agreed to pay income tax for the first time, and Buckingham Palace would be open to the public during the summer months, with ticket revenue directed toward the Windsor restoration. In August 1993, paying visitors walked through the state rooms of Buckingham Palace for the first time in the building's history. 19 rooms were opened. A route was laid out through Nash's picture gallery, the throne room, the green drawing room, and the ballroom. Tickets cost £8. The public came in enormous numbers. Over 500,000 visitors now pass through the palace each summer. The tour has expanded over the decades. In 2023, the East Wing was opened for the first time, allowing visitors to walk through the principal facade and step onto the famous balcony where the royal family waves during national celebrations. The moment was philosophical as much as financial. The building that no monarch had ever wanted to live in became a building that strangers paid to walk through. The private had become public. The rooms where Victoria had suffered and Edward had entertained and George had frozen were now exhibition spaces, roped off, climate-controlled, and explained by audio guides in 12 languages. The palace's identity fractured. It was no longer a home. It was not quite a museum. It occupied a space that Britain had no established word for. A working royal palace that is also a tourist attraction, that is also an office, that is also a symbol, that is also a drain on the public purse. It served every function and belonged to no one. The fire at Windsor had forced a reckoning. The palace had resisted change for nearly 2 centuries, absorbing monarchs, surviving bombs, outlasting political movements, and always demanding more money. Now it had been forced open, not by revolution, not by reform, by a curtain-catching light and a public that said, "If we are paying for this, we will see what we are paying for." The building accepted its visitors. It had no choice, but somewhere in its walls, the Tyburn still flowed, and the wiring still aged, and the next crisis was already forming in the gap between what the palace needed and what the nation was willing to give. Chapter 10. 369 million pounds of survival. 92% of the palace's electrical boards have exceeded their design life, and the bill to fix them could fund a small city. The resurfacing program was announced in November 2016. It was the largest single renovation of the palace since Nash's original transformation in the 1820s. The scope was total: 14,000 meters of new electrical wiring, 20,000 meters of new plumbing, removal of asbestos in quantities far greater than initial surveys had anticipated, replacement of boilers that were over 30 years old and had been operating on borrowed time for at least a decade. The lead drainage pipes, many of them original to the 19th century construction, had been sinking under their own weight for years. Water found new paths through old walls. The risk was not abstract. A single electrical fire in the palace's east wing, according to internal assessments, could cause damage estimated at £250 million. The building that had survived 16 wartime bomb strikes could be undone by a faulty wire. The initial cost estimate was £369 million over 10 years. This was funded by an increase in the sovereign grant, the annual payment from the Treasury to the Crown. The grant is calculated as a percentage of the Crown estate's net revenue. For the duration of the resurfacing, this percentage was raised from 15% to 25%. In the 2025 to 2026 financial year, the sovereign grant reached £132.1 million. A significant portion of this flows directly into the building. The palace consumes tens of millions of pounds each year, whether or not anyone sleeps there. Heating, cleaning, security, conservation, staff wages. The 775 rooms do not maintain themselves. The 800 staff do not work for free. The 39 acres of garden require constant tending. The building is a permanent employer, a permanent cost center, and a permanent political liability for whichever government happens to be writing the checks. The numbers tell a story of perpetual obligation. The palace does not ask whether it is loved. It does not require affection. It requires funding, and it receives it year after year because the alternative is unthinkable. To let it decay would be to let the physical fabric of the British state dissolve. To demolish it is impossible. To repurpose it is politically toxic. The building has trapped the nation in the same arrangement it once trapped the crown. You did not choose this, but you cannot leave. Chapter 11. The King Who Would Not Come Home. Every evening, King Charles III finishes his work at Buckingham Palace, walks 5 minutes down the Mall, and sleeps at Clarence House instead. Charles became king on the 8th of September, 2022, following the death of his mother at Balmoral. He was 73. He had spent his entire adult life preparing for the role. He had also spent much of it at Clarence House, which he had lovingly restored after the death of the Queen Mother in 2002. Clarence House is not grand by royal standards. It has a fraction of the rooms. It is warmer. It is quieter. It is, by every account, the place Charles considers home. He filled it with his own paintings. He planted its garden himself. He arranged its rooms to suit his habits, his schedule, and his temperament. The official explanation for his continued residence there is practical. The North Wing apartments at Buckingham Palace, where the sovereign's private rooms are located, are undergoing renovation as part of the resurfacing program. They will not be ready until 2027 at the earliest. Charles cannot move into rooms that are being rebuilt. The explanation is reasonable. It may even be true. But it also fits a pattern so consistent that coincidence becomes difficult to sustain. George III preferred Windsor. George IV never slept at the palace. William IV tried to give it away. Victoria fled to Balmoral and Osborne. George V endured it. George VI froze in it. Elizabeth II escaped to Windsor every weekend. And now Charles, offered the most famous address in Britain, commutes from a house down the road. The building has never been chosen. It has only been endured. Each monarch arrives, discovers the same cold corridors and the same impossible scale, and finds a way to be somewhere else. The pattern is not a coincidence. It is a verdict, delivered quietly, over 2.5 centuries, by every person who has ever held the keys. Whether Charles will eventually move in remains an open question. He may. The apartments may be finished, and duty may compel him, as it compelled his mother. But even if he does, the pattern suggests he will not stay. Not in spirit. The palace will have his presence. It will not have his heart. No monarch's heart has ever stayed. Chapter 12. The most beautiful prison in the world. The richest family in Britain, living in the most famous house on earth, has spent 2 centuries trying to escape it. Step back. Look at what has been built. 775 rooms, 1,514 doors, 760 windows, 40,000 pieces of silverware, 374 clocks, a picture gallery 155 feet long, a garden of 39 acres where flamingos live within sight of Victoria Station, a facade of Portland stone that has been photographed more often than any other building in Britain, a central balcony from which kings and queens have waved at millions. It is magnificent. It is also a trap. The logic is architectural, and it is inescapable. Every decision that made the palace more magnificent made it less livable. Nash's state rooms are beautiful because they were designed for ceremony, not for comfort. The corridors are grand because they were built to impress visitors, not to connect family members. The scale is vast because the building was intended to project the power of a nation, not to shelter the humans who happen to represent it. 775 rooms require 800 staff. 800 staff create a permanent population of strangers in what is nominally a private home. You cannot walk to your kitchen in your dressing gown. You cannot leave a book on a table without it being tidied away. You cannot argue with your spouse without the knowledge that 100 people on the other side of a hidden corridor know exactly what is happening. The palace does not permit private life. It permits only performance, and yet it endures. Not because anyone loves it, not because any monarch has fought to preserve it for its own sake. It endures because the ceremonies of the British state require a stage. The state banquets must happen somewhere. The ambassadors must present credentials somewhere. The crowds must gather somewhere on Coronation Day. The building has made itself necessary not through beauty or comfort, but through function. It is the machine that processes the rituals of monarchy. Without it, those rituals would need another home, and there is no other home. This is the tyranny of institutional obligation over personal will. The phrase sounds abstract until you watch a 73-year-old man walk past a 775-room palace every evening to sleep in a smaller house down the road. Then it becomes concrete. Then it becomes human. The Tyburn still flows beneath the courtyard. You cannot see it. You cannot hear it. But it is there, as it has been there since before the first Duke laid his first brick on the swamp above. The river does not care about the palace. The palace does not care about the people inside it. Both simply persist, following the logic of their own construction, indifferent to the wishes of anyone who passes through. The palace at dusk, lights on in empty rooms, the state rooms polished and prepared for tomorrow's engagements, the corridors quiet, the staff finishing their shifts and leaving through side entrances that the public never sees. The sovereign already gone for the evening, driven or walked to a smaller house where the rooms are warm and the paintings on the walls are his own. The building waits. It has always waited for the next monarch, the next renovation, the next crisis, the next £100 million. It does not hurry. It does not worry. It has outlasted every person who has ever tried to change it, escape it, or love it. It will outlast the current king. It will outlast the next. It is the most beautiful prison in the world. And the door, as always, is open. But no one can leave.